Hi everyone and welcome to the next part of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote: however hopeless the situation appears to be, there yet always exists the possibility of putting up a stubborn resistance. From the Estonian Grandmaster Paul Keres, who was among the world's top players from the mid-1930s to the mid-1960s. Now, a review of the last part where we discussed the concept of a past pawn's lust to expand with an illustration as well as game number 12 from the illustrative game section, and then discussed regarding the usefulness of a blockading point as explained by Nimzowitsch. So now, moving further into the book, Nimzowitsch discusses the third reason why a blockade is important and writes: the third reason, the crippling induced by a blockade is by no means local in its nature. The transplanting of the crippling phenomena to the ground in the rear, on the dual nature of the pawn, on the pessimistic outlook, and how this can be transformed into the blackest melancholy or feeling of pensive sadness. In game number 12, Leonhardt versus Nimzowitsch, the white bishop at c5 blocked black's pawn at c6. One of the consequences being that black's bishop at b7 was held a prisoner in his own camp. This state of affairs seems to be typical only very often. A whole complex of enemy pieces is sympathetically affected. Large tracts of the board are made impracticable for any maneuvering of the swifter kind. At times too, the whole enemy position takes on a strangely rigid character. In other words, the crippling effect has shifted from the blockaded pawn further back to its rear. To explain this concept further, Nimzowitsch gives another illustration through the help of a diagram where we have this position on board. He writes, in the position on board, the black E and D pawns are completely blockaded, and the whole of black's position seems benumbed or deprived of activity. Bishop and rook are prisoners in their own camp, and white, in spite of inferiority in material, actually has winning chances. The state of affairs here sketched need not surprise us in the least. We have often pointed out that any pawn may be an obstacle in the way of their own pieces, and that to get rid of the pawn may often be our dearest wish, as for instance if we are planning to open a file or to free a square for a knight. We see then that the blockade is not only embarrassing to the pawn itself, but much more so really to the pawn's comrades in arms, the rooks and bishops. In connection, by the way, with the pawn, it is important for the student to appreciate a certain dual nature which a pawn possesses. On the one hand, the pawn, as we have shown before, is quite willing to commit suicide, while on the other, the pawn clings tenaciously to life. For the presence of pawns, as the pawn knows, is not only of great importance for the endgame, but still more helps to prevent the establishment of enemy pieces within their own lines, which but for them might be possible, or to put it otherwise, prevents the creation of weak points in their territory. The mobility of a passed pawn, particularly of a center one, is often the very life nerve of the whole position. Its crippling must therefore naturally find its echo throughout the whole of that position. We have seen then that weighty reasons support the establishment of a blockade at the earliest possible moment, whereas those which seem to tell against it, namely the apparently uneconomical use made of an officer seemingly degraded to being a mere sentry, that is, blockader, will be seen on closer examination to carry weight only in certain cases. To be able to recognize these, we must now consider the blockader. Moving further, Nimzowitsch discusses regarding the blockader with the following heading: the blockader's primary and secondary functions, the conception of elasticity, various forms of the same, the strong and the weak blockader, how the blockader meets the many demands made on them, partly on their own initiative, and why I see in this a proof of the blockader's vitality. Nimzowitsch writes, the primary function of a blockader is obviously to blockade in a business-like manner the pawn concerned. In exercising this, the blockader has made themselves a tendency towards immobility, and yet admire the blockader's vitality. For the blockader very often displays pronounced activity. Number one, by the threats which they can exercise from the place where they are posted. Number two, by a certain elasticity which finds expression in the fact that they do on occasion leave their post. The blockader seems to be entitled to a furlough or leave of absence. Number A, if the journey promise much in results, when the connections must all be made by express, so to speak. B, if the blockader can be sure of returning quickly enough to take up the blockade again on another square, should the pawn have advanced in the interval. C, if the blockader be in a position to leave a deputy in their place to look after the blockade. It is obvious that such a deputy must be chosen from those pieces which are seconding or protecting the blockader. This last consideration, for all its apparent insignificance, is of great importance, for it shows clearly the extent to which elasticity, at any rate in the form considered under point C, is directly dependent on the degree of weakness or strength of the blockade. In the connection with point A, see the endgame Nimzowitsch versus Nilsson. Since this endgame is featured further into the chapter, we shall go through it in due course, and you can skip forward to the relevant video to view it once it is covered. Moving further, Nimzowitsch writes, in connection with point B, consider the position on board. In this simplest of positions, the blockading rook takes a little holiday trip. Rook takes on b4. It goes without saying that the passed pawn will seize the opportunity to advance. h4, rook b2, h3, and rook h2. Master Rook appears in the office, bows to the boss, nods to his fellow employees, and as if he were fresh as paint and thoroughly rested, though he had to do some bustling to get back in time, takes his seat at his blockading desk. He has, however, changed his seat from h4 to h2. The maneuver here shown may be found repeated in many an example. In connection with point C, see the role played by the white bishop at f4 in game number 15 of the illustrative game section, white's 26th move. Again, we are going to be leaving this near towards the end of the series. Once the video series is complete, you can fast forward to the relevant video to see the game's coverage. Nimzowitsch continues, from the above little discussion under points A, B and C, we see that elasticity is slight if the pawn to be blockaded is far advanced. The maximum elasticity is on the other hand developed when a half-passed pawn in the center of the board is the object of the blockader's attentions. In such a position as for instance in the skeleton position on board, the blockading knight at d4 is here very elastic and can take long journeys from their post and in all directions, and yet not neglect their primary duty, which is to prevent the advance of black's d-pawn. So much on the subject of elasticity. We will now analyze the actual effect of the blockade itself. Here Nimzowitsch discusses regarding effect of the blockade and writes, the forces to maintain a blockade should be developed systematically and of set purpose, whereas elasticity often comes of itself without seeking. The blockading effect is intensified by bringing up supports, which however in their turn must be safely stationed. The bishop in the position on board will for motives of personal safety migrate to g6. Though to be sure, the blockading rook will thus lose a powerful support. Nevertheless, for the bishop to play about on the long diagonal is a somewhat risky game. For the eye of the law, queen at d4 is upon the bishop. After bishop g6, there follows, however, king b5, and now the attempt to restore the abandoned strategical connection by bishop e8 fails badly after queen e5 check, king d7, queen takes on e8 check, king takes on e8, and king takes on c6. On the other hand, in the position on board, the bishop can go to f3, where they stand safe and cannot be dislodged, and the rook at c6 thus gains so much in importance that a draw seems inevitable. We have shown a similar state of affairs to exist in our study of outposts. In like manner, here the blockader derives strength not so much from themselves as from their strategical connection with the country to their rear. A blockader who is insufficiently or imperfectly protected will not be able to hold their own against the enemy pieces which are hotly pressing them. The blockader will be put to flight and either taken or put out of action, whereupon the pawn whose road had before been blocked will resume their advance. In connection with the problem of the defense, the reader will find extraordinarily valuable the rules which will be treated in part 2 of this book on the overprotection of strategical points. The blockading point is, as a rule, a strategically important square, and therefore it is part of wisdom to protect it even more than is absolutely necessary. So do not wait for attacks to pile up. Rather, lay up a reserve of defensive force, just as before a dance, one lays up a store of sleep. And so a remarkable fact appears that while the effect of the blockade can only be intensified or even maintained by laboriously bringing up supports, the other secondary virtues of the blockader, elasticity and the threats the blockader can exercise from their post, prove to be of hard growth. That is to say, they come to fulfillment without any particular exertion on the blockader's part, like thistles on stony ground. This is explicable, number one, by the state of affairs in which a protecting piece takes the place of the blockader who has gone to travels. Number two, by the fact that, as explained previously, the blockading square tends to become a weak point for the enemy. Keeping contact with the strategically important square must, according to my system, work wonders. This will be considered in greater detail under position play. We can sum all this up in the following principle. Though in the choice of a blockader, elasticity and the threats a blockader can exercise must be borne in mind, yet is often sufficient merely to strengthen the blockade. Elasticity and the rest will then not seldom come of themselves. It must now be clear that an officer in no sense compromises their dignity by answering the summons to act as a blockader, for the post proves itself to be a most honorable one, safe yet allowing full initiative. The student should thoroughly test the truth of this observation from master games or games played by themselves. They should compare the blockaders with one another, their respective merits, their ultimate fate, and how they came to fail or to succeed in their duty, and the student will get more benefit out of a thorough knowledge of one actor than from a nodding acquaintance with the whole troupe. It is when working under limitations that the master reveals themselves. This true saying applies wholly also to the aspirant to mastership, indeed to every student who is in earnest. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system here, and we shall continue onwards from the next one. Shout out to fellow streamer Skwerly for gifting 40 tier 1 and 3 tier 2 subs to viewers on my stream last week. What can I say? The city streets went on a roll. Thank you for the love, Derek. Distant 187 for continuing his sub and gifting a tier 3 sub, which also happens to be the first tier 3 sub to my Twitch channel. Distant is a talented player from the US. Walkerboy with a gifted sub, and then karmadumpster, the top cheerer with a generous 5,000 bits. Skwerly at second with 3,000 bits, fellow streamer Farraway with 400 bits at third, and then anonymous support with 1,500 bits last week as well. Thank you for the support, everyone, much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care and stay safe.